Hey everyone! Photography is mostly a hands-on creative job or hobby. You spend time out on location, you get to have fun experiences. Those are all the things we see online and in our portfolios with our finished images. Today, I want to talk to you about the part of the job we don't usually share online and don't really talk about that much, which is the whole post-photo shoot workflow. So while I will be talking about some editing, if you want a complete editing workflow, I'll leave some of those videos linked down below. Today, I'm more focused on things like memory cards, backups, file management, NAS systems, and things along those lines. I actually do have a really old video on YouTube about this topic, and it's funny because if you go back and rewatch that after you finish watching this video, you'll see that after 5 or so years, nothing has really changed much, which is a really good sign of a reliable workflow. I've been doing this system almost since I started my photography business. I had a couple of tweaks towards the beginning of figuring the system out. Now I've been doing the same thing for at least 10 years. So I just want to make a fresh video about this. So please feel free to copy my system, or if you're working out your own, maybe this can give you some ideas. So let's get into it. So after a photo shoot is finished and I get home, I immediately download my memory cards. And I do this whether I'm at home or I'm doing a destination job overseas. My shooting day is only finished once I download and back up my cards. The reason for this is to keep my files safe. I want them in various locations as soon as possible. So even though I already shoot redundant to 2 cards in my camera, I still also want my photos on an SSD drive as soon as possible. You never know if your camera or laptop might get stolen. If you leave your memory card in your camera for days at a time, you might forget if you've downloaded those files or not, and you don't want to accidentally format the card thinking you have downloaded them when you actually haven't. So just to avoid any sort of confusion like that, I always download after I finish taking photos, no matter how big or small the shoot is. Instead of downloading directly to my computer or laptop, I personally like to use an SSD drive. This is where I keep all my photos and footage. I like to do this to keep my computer free for software, and if anything goes wrong with my computer, I don't lose any access to my files. So let's say my Mac Studio stops working one day, which I really hope it doesn't, I can easily grab the SSD and plug it into my laptop instead to continue working while I figure out what's wrong with my computer. Next, we have my file naming system, which I actually learned from a photographer who I used to shoot for, who is very talented. I thought this was such a great idea, so I implemented it into my own workflow, and I've only made a little tweak to this one since the last video I made. So when I'm ready to download a photo shoot, I will make a new folder and start by naming it with the date backwards. I'll have the year 23, then the month, so let's say 10, and finally the day the photo shoot was done, so let's do 16. This will help keep all your work in chronological order, so it's super easy to go back and find something if you ever need anything. Next, I'll add a hyphen, and since I'm a photographer who offers a few different genres of photography to my clients, I will write what kind of photo shoot it was. So for example, I'll put fashion or portrait or wedding, family, headshot, anything to just describe what the photo shoot is. I'll then add another hyphen after that, and finally finish naming the folder with the client's name. The change I made was I used to use a different symbol. I would use the long dash symbol in between because it looked aesthetic. The problem with that is that it caused issues on Windows, so I decided to replace that with a hyphen instead, which is readable between both options. Another option is, if you don't like to use the full stops in between the date, is you can use the hyphen there instead and use an underscore in between the categories. Within that folder, I will then make a folder called 01 Deselects, where I will download the bulk of the photo shoot to. Once I do the culling process, I will move all my selected photos that I want to edit into a new folder called 02 Selects. I will then make a folder called 03 Lightroom, where I will save the Lightroom catalog for that photo shoot. I personally like to make a new catalog for every single shoot that I do. I shoot very frequently, so having one catalog for everything will become very large way too quickly, so I like to just concentrate on getting a client finished on its own and then moving on to the next catalog instead. Finally, I have a folder called 04 Export, which includes the final images I will be delivering to the client. Inside that folder, I have separate high-res and low-res folders too. So once a shoot is downloaded, it's time to back it up. The general general rule of thumb when it comes to keeping your files safe is the 3-2-1 method. There are in total 3 copies of your photo shoot. The first is the primary copy that you use to edit from, and then 2 backups with at least one of them being offline. What I normally do is I have the SSD where I first download my cards to, and that's where I edit from. Then I have 2 NAS systems, which are basically copies of each other and are kept in separate locations. Another option is you can have one NAS and then the last backup is online. Is it expensive? Yes, it can be, especially when you've been doing photography for an accumulated amount of time. So if you're starting out with your business or still in your early to mid stages of figuring out your pricing, be sure to keep backups of your photos in mind to include into your pricing. It is unfortunately a necessary evil. I personally prefer to do everything I can to keep my files safe because I just never want to have a conversation with a wedding client, for example, telling them that I've lost their photos. It's just not on my list of things to do. So once the photos have been delivered and the client is happy, I will then replace the old backups with the new version of the folder from my SSD, which now includes the separated colored and uncolored photos, the Lightroom catalog, and the exported images. And I delete it from my SSD. So at the end of the day, with completely finished clients, I will end up with 2 copies of that photo shoot on 2 separate NASs, plus the high-res edited images backed up in the cloud as well. With our photo shoot downloaded and safely backed up, it is time to start editing. Again, I'm not going to go into huge detail about this because I do have other videos about my editing workflow and potential workflows for you depending what editing software you like to use, so I'll leave those linked down below. But my general workflow is that I like to start by culling my photos in Photo Mechanic, and I still use Photo Mechanic after all these years. This software shows you a high-res preview of your photos so you can quickly go through each photo one by one and give them a star rating. The preview is high-res, so you can zoom in to 100% to check critical focus, and this is so important because a wedding, for example, you have thousands of images that you're going through, so if you have to wait in between each one for it to load, it's going to waste a heap of time that you could be using to do something else. Culling photos basically means to choose the photos you want to edit from the entire set of photos. For example, sometimes you'll take a burst of photos of something and that set of 10 images all basically look the same. Maybe one is out of focus and in a couple of others there are people blinking. When you cull your photos, you can choose the best one out of that 10 to edit and deliver to your client. Once I've chosen which photos I want to edit with a starring system, I'll move those photos into my O2 Selects folder. Next, we have the coloring part of the process where I do a few different things depending what the photo shoot is. If it's a portrait session with a small amount of photos, anywhere between 10 to 40 images, I will make a new Lightroom catalog saved in our 03 Lightroom folder, import the photos and color them myself. If I'm editing a wedding, on the other hand, I've started using a software called Imagen AI, which I have 2 videos that go into a whole workflow with them that you can check out if you want. But again, I'll make a Lightroom catalog with the culled wedding photos and then use Imagen AI to automatically edit them for me. Then I'll get the catalog back so I can take a look through it all and make any tweaks. After coloring my images, sometimes I will then do some skin retouching. I usually only do skin retouching for portrait and fashion photo shoots where there are a heap of close-up images of my subject. Most of the portrait sessions I share here on YouTube or the photos I post to Instagram, I have done skin retouching on. So I use Photoshop and I use a method called frequency separation. Again, I have a whole tutorial about this on my channel too. I don't normally retouch wedding photos or e-commerce or events, for example, because the workflow would just take way too long. Skin retouching is a very time-consuming process. It could take anywhere between 3 minutes to an hour to retouch a portrait. With weddings, the majority of photos are not really close-up headshots anyway, so retouching is not really needed. If there is a mark on the bride and groom's clothes, or someone has a temporary injury or blemish like a cut or a bruise or something, then I would just remove that in Lightroom with the healing tool. These, by the way, are my export settings out of Lightroom. I select JPEG as my image format, quality is at 100, my color space is sRGB because I mostly provide photos for the web to my clients, and I also keep my resolution at 300. I will save a high-res JPEG which can be used for posting on Instagram or printing, Then I will export a second low resolution copy where I keep all the exact same settings, except now I tick resize to fit, and I like to select the long edge and set it to 1920 or 2000 for a copy. Doing it this way will then keep whatever aspect ratio you had on your images without having to calculate it. Then I'll go back into Adobe Bridge, which is where I like to do most of my file management, and I separate the high-res and low-res photos into the properly named folders that we created within the 04 export folder. A nice little touch I like to add is renaming all my files. I select all the images, right-click, and then select Batch Rename. I'll add the name of my client and a consecutive number. That way, all the files have a nice-looking name rather than just the standard name that the camera gives it. This also further improves being able to quickly search in my NAS or cloud storage for the files in the future. Finally, in this long process, it's time to deliver the photos to your client. I have two ways of doing this. If I'm providing photos for an e-commerce store or a business, I will upload all the high-res and low-res files to Dropbox so they can easily download them and do whatever they want with the images. If I'm providing photos to an individual for a wedding or a portrait session, I like to use a website called Pixieset. None of the programs or websites I mentioned today are sponsored, by the way. These are all just the things that I normally like to use. Pixieset does a really nice job of displaying your images in a beautiful way, so it's a nice experience to your client when they're looking through all the photos. I also like that you can see many photos on the page, which works really well for weddings. Compared to the experience on Dropbox, which is more utilitarian, you can only see a thumbnail preview of the overall gallery, and you have to go through each image one by one, which wouldn't work so well for weddings, but it does for fashion photography clients. I also like to use Narrative to put together layouts for my blog posts. It makes it so quick and easy, just clicking and dragging images around and then exporting the layout to upload to my blog. And that is it. That is my entire post-photo shoot workflow, from downloading my images to delivering them to my client. Let me know what you think, and if you do anything differently in your workflow, let me know in the comments. I'm sure it'll be really helpful to anyone watching to see other ideas and way of doing things. But as always, thank you so much for watching. I make new videos every single week, so I will see you next time. Bye.